Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait.
As an American born abroad, I grew up in Kuwait during my early childhood. In 2003, when the U.S. invaded Iraq for the second time, I was only 7 years old. Until now, I can still vividly remember the air raid sirens going off and my family and I running for cover in our duct tape sealed room, hoping that we'd be protected from any Iraqi Scud missiles and their possible chemical payloads. Because of this, I've always been interested in the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and how the U.S. led Allied troops to help Kuwait regain its sovereignty. In 1990, on August 2nd, Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait and violated its sovereignty. This aggressive move by Iraq was condemned by 2/3 of the Arab League and Saudi Arabia's King Fahd, the powerhouse in the region. In response, the United States, along with its NATO allies, with the blessing of the United Nations Security Council, formed a coalition of freedom fighters to expel the 300,000-strong occupying Iraqi army in Operation Desert Storm. Allied troops totaled 750,000, with the majority of soldiers supplied by the U.S., and smaller contingents joined from Britain, France, Germany, the Soviet Union, Japan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, among other nations. Iraq, for its part, only had the diplomatic support of Jordan, Algeria, the Sudan, Yemen, Tunisia, and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO. Operation Desert Storm began on January 17th of 1991 and only lasted 42 days. After constant coalition domination using air and ground offensives, U.S. President George Bush calls a ceasefire on February 28th of 1991. The terms of the ceasefire meant that Iraq not only had to recognize Kuwait's sovereignty, but also had to get rid of their weapons of mass destruction. Ultimately, with Saddam Hussein's capitulation, the Allies won, and the balance of power in the international system was restored. The president of Iraq during the 1990 Kuwait invasion, Saddam Hussein, shed some light on why he invaded Kuwait. From 1980 to 1988, Iraq was involved in a war with Iran. During this 8-year war, Iraq borrowed money from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and other states and ended up with around $80 billion in debt. When the war was over, Iraq needed to rebuild its economy and infrastructure and pay back this borrowed money. Since oil was its main source of income, the country would have to rely on its oil sales to do this. However, the price of oil at the time was a very low $7 per barrel. Saddam blamed Kuwait in particular for pushing down the price of oil, and thus preventing Iraq's recovery. Attempting to raise the price of oil to $17 per barrel, Iraq lobbied at an Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, meeting, where supposedly other countries agreed to raise the prices. Unfortunately, Kuwait did not stick to the agreement and continued to overproduce and drive prices down. Even worse, Iraq also accused Kuwait of slant drilling into the Ras Rumaila oil field. Basically, Saddam believed that Kuwait was stealing some of Iraq's oil supply. Another reason Saddam felt justified to invade Kuwait was because Iraqis considered Kuwait as being part of the Iraqi Basra province since the 1600s, when the northeast portion of Arabian Peninsula became part of the Ottoman Empire. When Great Britain took over control of the Iraqi coastal territories from the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century, they too considered Kuwait as part of Iraq. After World War I, the British insisted that Kuwait separate from Iraq and be its own sovereign state. Iraq resisted the separation at the time, but to no avail. So during the 1990 invasion, Saddam believed it was his right to annex Kuwait. I'm standing here outside of the United Nations in Kuwait. A key player involved before and after Operation Desert Storm was the United Nations. This intergovernmental organization and its body, the Security Council, initially attempted to compel Iraq to withdraw its troops from Kuwait, by implementing economic sanctions. Unfortunately, this did not work, and the 10 non-permanent members and 5 permanent members, including the United States, Great Britain, China, France, and Russia, voted that military action had to be taken. To fulfill the resolution, a coalition of 34 countries supplied soldiers to oust the Iraqi occupants from Kuwait. After the war, the United Nations established United Nations Iraq-Kuwait Observation Mission, or UNICOM, in April of 1991. Its task was to monitor the demilitarized zone along the Iraq-Kuwait border, deter border violations, and report any hostile action. The mandate of the mission was completed on October 6 of 2003. As well, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, gave humanitarian aid to help repatriate Kuwaiti refugees who had fled during the occupation and rebuild after the Iraqis left Kuwait in shambles. The UNHCR provides critical emergency assistance in the form of clean water, sanitation, and healthcare, as well as shelter, blankets, household goods, and sometimes food. They also arrange transport and assistance packages for people who return home and income-generating projects for those who resettle. Realism at the individual level showed that Saddam was a power-seeking warmonger who was mentally unstable and acted irrationally. He was well known to be tyrannical and dangerous. The Emir of Kuwait did not want to lose his power, and King Fahd of Saudi Arabia desired to keep Saddam from potentially becoming equal with him in the Arab world. Looking at realism from the state level, while Iraq was warring with Iran, Saudi Arabia became the powerhouse in the region, overshadowing Iraq's once formidable influence. War was inevitable to regain its once lost power and restore balance. In addition, if Iraq was allowed to take Kuwait, then Saudi Arabia would share a border with Iraq. This would always put Saudi at risk that Iraq could attempt to take over parts of Saudi territory. On the other hand, Iraq may have been victimized by Kuwait's overproduction of oil and slant drilling, which kept oil prices down and encroached on Iraq's resources, thus leading to no other possibility but war. As far as realism within the international system, this war should not come as a surprise, as states within the system constantly seek power or attempt to retain power, as was the case of Iraq versus Kuwait. Liberalism at the individual level showed that George Bush used his collaborative style to rally the international community to come to Kuwait's aid. He acted selflessly and preferred to cooperate with other world leaders to solve this problem. Liberalism at the state level showed that the US, Saudi Arabia, and the coalition allies were considered magnanimous heroes for coming to Kuwait's aid. Iraq was bad and greedy for its unprovoked invasion against a relatively weaker state, militarily speaking. The international system, from the liberalist perspective in this case, displayed that Kuwait's sovereignty was dependent on other states coming to its aid. Such interdependence and cooperation was the only way that a quick resolution should be realized while mitigating the risk of the states coming to Kuwait's rescue. As an individual, radicals would believe that Saddam's selfish desire to increase his own personal wealth showed that he had little regard for the people of his nation. The state's wealth was his wealth, and he lived in lavish palaces with vast grounds while his people lived in impoverished conditions. Likewise, all individuals involved were out for capitalistic gains. The Emir of Kuwait did not want to lose his lucrative means of amassing wealth. President George Bush may have believed that by coming to Kuwait's aid, that they would be indebted to the U.S. and give the country a break on future oil prices, which would only help the president gain favor in the eyes of the American people. The state for radicals will always support actions that bring capitalistic gain to the bourgeoisie. Iraq wanted to get out of paying its debt and to gain the capitalistic influence of having control over more of the world's oil reserves by overtaking Kuwait's natural resources. The U.S. and its allies wanted to keep Iraq from the ability to control the price of oil. Also, by helping liberate Kuwait, they could potentially lower the price of oil and the price of gas at the pumps. Looking through the prism of a constructivist, George Bush acted in a socially acceptable manner by coming to the aid of Kuwait, who the world saw as the underdog in this situation. They had few means in which to defend themselves against an aggressor like Iraq at the time. The Emir of Kuwait, along with George Bush and King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, gained support for Kuwait because other leaders believed that Saddam's actions were socially unacceptable. On the other hand, Saddam felt the need to establish fairness in a situation where others were not enforcing agreed upon rules of behavior. From this perspective, it may have been better for Saddam to use the international community to work this out without needing to use military force against Kuwait. The escalation of the situation occurred because the states involved created the situation through action or inaction. From the liberalist and constructivist point of view, other key players within the international system were the IGOs of NATO, the UN, the Arab League, and OPEC. Without the influence of these international governmental organizations, Operation Desert Storm may have never happened, and Iraq may have gained a 19th province, Kuwait. Having said that, had these bodies taken a more active role in intervening on Iraq's behalf when it claimed that Kuwait was stealing oil, then maybe a war would have never happened in the first place. To conclude, Kuwait offered little deterrence and was not a military threat to Iraq. Saddam took the U.S.'s silence prior to the invasion as silent consent that annexing Kuwait was acceptable. Saddam perceived Kuwait as the economic aggressor because of slant drilling in Kuwait's overproduction of oil, which was forcing prices down. Iraq's realist retaliatory invasion of Kuwait, however, did not pay off, and leading its citizens into another costly war was a mistake. Saddam may have been better off by taking a more liberalist approach to the matter, like Kuwait did by building allies instead of enemies. In fact, Kuwait found allies in the West and most of the Arab nations. These allies built a cooperative coalition or collective to assist in the liberation of Kuwait and ultimately maintain an ongoing protective shield against further aggression by Iraq. Sanctions were used first, and when this failed, military force was necessary. Moreover, Iraqi weapons of mass destruction were a concern for the international community, and Iraq was made to disarm and go through UN inspections of compliance. By maintaining arms control over Iraq, the coalition believed that long-term stability and security could be achieved. The good news for Kuwait and her allies is that Iraq was forced back and Kuwait regained its sovereignty. The bad news is that this interstate war saw casualties on both sides and many lives were destroyed. Having said that, the lives of the masses may mean little to the state and to leaders when there's so much to lose. Bottom line, a country's sovereignty is to be respected, especially if there are capitalistic gains to be had. Finally, the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq is a prime example of how disturbance in the balance of power, greed, and aggression with the international system can force leaders of the world to declare this means war.